Now, before we continue, let's get a really good understanding of the higher order component pattern and how they work. So the higher order component pattern is a very common pattern you see not only in React projects everywhere, but in the React ecosystem as a whole. Lots of libraries essentially give you higher order components that allow you to provide your components the functionality that that library brings. So we saw that earlier with our with router higher order component, and we'll see it a lot whenever we use Redux because Redux provides us with a connect higher order component. But here we're going to explore what they do under the hood by writing our own. And it's very easy. So in order to understand it, I've got this quick project here that you can download so that you can follow along. And all it has right now is just a simple user profile component that gets a name and an email and then renders out an H1 and an H2 of that name and email. Now, as we know, components are essentially just functions and classes that receive some props, right? Like this name and this email property, and then it returns us some markup. In a similar manner, a higher order component is just a function that gets a component and returns us a new enhanced component. So how do I mean by that? Well, in order to understand this, we kind of have to see why we need higher order components in the first place. And the best way to do that is if we were given a task to, let's say, expand our user profile component to also display some posts that belong to our user. So how do we do that? Well, let's say we had to fetch some posts from backend, right? Just like we did with our Monsters Rolodex, we're going to use this JSON placeholder site, and we're going to pull down the posts. So we are going to, in our constructor for our component, add a state, right? Because we need to be able to display our posts. So this .state will be equal to an object with a posts that has an empty array. And then in our component did mount lifecycle method, we are going to fetch this data from this URL. And then we are going to make sure that our response is in JSON. And now we're just going to store our data as our posts. So let's do this .set state where our posts is equal to data. And now in order to log it, we're just going to add this quickly into our component by mapping over this .state.posts. And we are going to map over that and render out simple div with a class name of post. So I have provided some very basic styles for us so that we can at least understand just what's going on. And inside is an H1 with our post.title and a p tag that has our post body, post.body. And let's not forget our key is going to be post.id. And now if we look in our application, we'll see that we are rendering out these quick posts, right? Now there's a lot of them. So let's say we only wanted to display 3 because this is way too much information. We would just do a data.splice .slice from 0 to 3. So we would slice out, so these 3. Awesome. Okay, now we have this component that fetches some data and then reduces the quantity of data that is being displayed, right? But what happens, let's say, if we wanted to do another component that does almost the same thing, except it displays a list of our users. So we'll make a user list component profile. and we'll do user list.component.jsx. We'll import React from React. And we'll do class user list extends React.component. And we'll do a very similar thing where we will render out a very similar component that has a div. And inside this div has a class name of container, which has some of the base styles, but also this user list class, which just changes the background color. And let's say we just had an h1 that said users list. And let's export this as the default user list. So now, if we were to pull this into our app.js components, user list component, and if we were to just render this above our user profile list, we would see our user list component. Now, what we want to do is we just want to display users in a similar format, right? And in our user list, we would do exactly the same thing that we had here, except perhaps instead of posts, it would be users. And then instead of posts, let's just say we're fetching from this users endpoint. And then we just do this. We set the users. And now we map over this .state.users. And we want to return a similar thing where it's just got the h1 key is equal to user.id. And we render user.name and a h2 that says user.email. Also make this a post just so that we get that styling. Right? Okay. So if we look at our components, they're actually very similar, right? They fetch from some data source URL, and then they just set the state. So if we were to do this for, let's say, 5 different components, we would be writing this same code essentially 5 different times. Like we already see that we had to write this code twice. So what a higher order component can do for us is we can actually wrap this functionality inside of a function. And then when we pass the component, it'll return us a version of our component, but modified to have this code in it. So how we would do that is we would make a new file called, let's say, withdata.js. And all this does is it returns a function. So let's do, let's just import React from React. And we would declare a constant called withData, which is equal to a function that takes a component and then it returns class called withData, which extends React.component. And inside of our component, we want to have this information. We want it to do this stuff that it was doing before. And then inside of our component, we want this URL to change depending on what we pass to it, right? So what we can do is we can have that as the second argument, as a data source. And then we would just change this over to data source. And instead of posts, because we don't know what it is, we'll just put it as data. And now in our render statement, we're going to return, it's going to be called wrapped component actually, right? Because the wrapped component is the component that is being wrapped in our withData component. So we are going to return the wrapped component where data is going to be a property that we're passing in from our state, right? This .state.data. And then we're going to give it any other props that might have been on our actual application. This thing is what our with data returns. It's going to return with data. And then we're going to export default with data. Now, when we look at this, right, our with data is a function that takes any component and then some data source URL, and then it returns us a new component that has this on it that then gives us our data from that data source after it's been sliced, right, and fetched into our component as a data property. So now if we look at our user profile, we don't even need that code anymore. And how we would use this is instead of this.state.posts, we would do this.data because we know we're going to get our posts in from our data. And now, in fact, I'm not even going to use a class component because now we can just use a functional component. And it's going to get the properties of data, name, and email. And let's just get rid of this so that we now know that what we're getting in is the data from our wrapped component. So how we would use it is we would import with data from our with data file, and then we would wrap our user profile in that. And we would still export our user profile component out of our file the same way, except now it's going to be what gets returned by passing our user profile into with data. And then I got to remember to pass that URL. So let's just get that URL again. And this is our posts. And now we'll see that our code is still working here, right? Now, if we were to do the exact same thing with our user list, we would just import with data from with data. And then we don't need this anymore either. So we can also convert this over to a functional component. And then we know that we are going to get this users as our data. And now instead of users, we're just going to map data. And make sure to wrap our function with data. And we just need to make sure to pass in the same URL, except with users instead of posts. And if we check, we see that we got the same functionality, except we're getting it without having to repeat our code. We are passing into our with data our component, right? And then our with data is giving us back a enhanced component with some functionality. And then we're just passing along that data into our component. Now we can do this with all kinds of things. I'm only using this data style of fetching because that's an example of what kind of higher order component we can write. But this kind of component structure is very versatile. We can write all kinds of higher order components that do different things for us. For example, that with router higher order component just passes into our component access to those location, match, and history objects, right? That we saw whenever we used that with router higher order component. And just as similar, our with data does exactly that. We can even go a step further and have it so that if there's no data, right, like other functionalities we can do, is we can have it so that if this.state.data.length is less than 1, then I want to render the text loading. Otherwise, right, I want to render an H1 that says loading. So now if we refresh, we see that it says loading. And how we can see, it's a little quick. Let's just do a this.set timeout for, let's say 1.5 seconds. And inside, we'll do the fetch here. No, this does just a set timeout. See, both are loading. And then when they're loaded, right, then it loads our component. And we got that just by modifying our higher order component. So this is the main benefit of higher order components. It lets us pass in a component, do something to it, or modify and give it these enhanced features, and then we can return it. And we're always passing all our props, right, that we get with our with data into our wrapped component, in case there are some props that we don't even use for our wrapped component. Another way you can see that this is being done is if instead of doing our data source in our function, we want to pass it in as a prop. So what we could do is we could do this.props.dataSource if we wanted to pass it in as a prop instead. So by doing that, we actually are able to write our components like this. So our user profile and our user list component, instead of passing into our with data here, wherever we called it, we would just pass it a prop. So we would just do data source is equal to, let's use this URL. So for user list, it'll be users. And then for our user profile, it'll be posts. And now if we look at our application, it still works the exact same way. Except now our with data higher order component is using this data source property in order to get the URL from where it fetches the data. So the great thing about this pattern as well is that our wrap component still gets all of the props that it needs, which is how our user profile component is still getting name and email, because we are spreading all of the props that this with data component is receiving. So even though in app.js we are passing in a data source and an name and email, and even though our component only uses the data source, we pass all those other props that we don't want into our wrapped component. So this is a key step that we got to do in every single higher order component pattern that we write. But another thing we can do is that because we don't need to pass our data source property into our wrap component, we can actually strip it out. And to do so, we would just destructure out our data source, right? And then spread everything else into an other props constant, which we pull from this dot props. And now instead of spreading in this dot props, we spread in other props. And now our app still works, except it's cleaner. So this pattern of higher order components is very key, and it's simple. Now, its functionality, like how we can use it to do what, is definitely complex, right? It takes practice. Looking at your code and thinking about what is worth pulling out into a higher order component. But the concept is hopefully very simple, as I'm hoping that I've shown. It's just a function that takes a component and then returns a new component that has additional functionality on it that renders out our original component that we gave to it.